This is Policy Talks, brought to you each month by Williamson Inc., our local Chamber of Commerce, and we appreciate all of you joining us this morning, particularly our audience on WCTV and on WAKM AM 950. We enjoy having our virtual audience with us this morning, and look forward to having a great discussion with our panelists this morning. One of our panelists has, thank you, Brandon, we keep you muted. You've got an audio issue. We'll circle back to you here in just a minute. Our panelists this morning are our Williamson County Legislative Delegation from the state legislature, Senator Jack Johnson, our Senate Majority Leader, Representative Glenn Cassidy, representing the 63rd District, Representative Sam Whitson from the 65th District, and Representative Brandon Ogles from the 61st. And that is in order of seniority, gentlemen, not putting anybody ahead of anybody else, but just start off this morning congratulating Tom Lawrence. He received a very prestigious award this week from Leadership Franklin, and I want to congratulate Tom. He's been awfully good to this program and to me personally over the years. And this Carolyn Cross Award is for leadership, I'm going to read this, that motivates and inspires other individuals along with traits of creativity, character, dedication, and community service. I can't imagine anyone that deserves that award more than Tom Lawrence. And Tom, we just want to say congratulations, and we want to second that motion. So he's out there virtually somewhere, and we want to pass that along. Gentlemen, it's been a volatile year in many ways. We got off to a somewhat normal start this year. Typical legislative issues, the legislative back and forth. And then in February and early March, things took a curve, and the coronavirus sent the world into a tailspin. We've got a wave now of racial protests going on that kind of raise a lot of uncertainty in our world about not only the proper way to respond, but how does that affect us? And then, as if to kind of go along with the volatile theme of the year, last Friday night, you all had a fairly contentious session that lasted till 3 a.m. Saturday morning. So it has been an interesting year, I know, for you all in almost every way it could possibly be. The Friday night session was a kind of a standoff between the Senate and the House, as I understand it. Jack, if you would kind of give us the Senate side of the version of what happened, and then I'll circle back and let our representatives respond. But tell us what happened. You had a couple of very significant bills that you were unable to reach consensus on, and just how can that happen?
Sure, Dave. Good morning. And before I jump into that, let me echo the thoughts and sentiments you expressed about Tom Lawrence. He's certainly a jewel of this community and the crown of this community. And we certainly celebrate his receiving that award. It's very, very well deserved. He's interviewed me a number of times, always throws me a curveball, as is pretty common for him. So congratulations, Tom. Very well deserved. Yeah, Dave, you put it very well. What a strange year we've had in 2020. And I think we'll all be glad to get it behind us and move on. And hopefully next year will be better. The two bills you're referring to, you're right. And this is fairly normal in our legislative process. I think my House colleagues would agree. It's kind of like life. You know, the difficult items sometimes get kicked to the end. They get procrastinated. We procrastinate on not procrastinate. Sometimes they just take more work, and so sometimes the really complicated, more difficult issues sometimes get pushed to the end. That was the case on the two you mentioned. we want and we need, and I think we will ultimately pass some type of liability protection for everyone in our state relative to COVID-19. That includes the private sector businesses. The businesses want to open. We want them to open. We want people to go out, but the businesses are afraid someone might accuse them of doing something that causes a customer to catch COVID-19. This applies to churches, hospitals, schools, local governments. There's pretty broad consensus that we need some type of liability protection. This is not to protect bad actors. If someone is flagrantly in violation of CDC guidelines and that what we refer to as the Tennessee Pledge here in Tennessee, that lays out what you need to do to protect your employees and protect customers. If you're in flagrant violation of that, you should be sued, and we're not going to do anything about that. But if you're making every effort to be substantially compliant with the guidelines, then you should be protected from frivolous lawsuits. So that was one bill that we got that we were unable to pass right there at the 11th hour, and kind of an unrelated, but in our process, it ended up being a companion type bill relative to telemedicine and the ability for doctors to be able to treat patients like this in many instances. And that's an important bill because, if you are sick or if you have COVID-19, we don't want you going to the doctor's office and sitting in a waiting room if you can consult with your doctor like this. And so those were two bills that we weren't able to get across the finish line, unfortunately. I'm not going to blame the House or the Senate. We just had a difference of opinion, specifically on the liability about retroactivity, about when it should go back. The Senate felt very strongly that it should go back to March 5th, which is when effectively, we got the first case of COVID-19 in the state of Tennessee. And the House was less comfortable with that degree of retroactivity. So that's where we ended up. A good possibility we maybe get called back into special session to take up those two issues again. And I can't tell you that will happen, but there are conversations about that.
Okay. Brandon Ogles, you, I think, are on the record as voting against a couple of those bills that Jack mentioned, the coronavirus liability, the telemedicine. Tell us your side of the story. Tell us what the House's concerns were and why you couldn't reach agreement with the Senate.
Well, Jack did a great job explaining it, but the pivot point for the House was really the retroactivity, especially at the date at which it was implemented. There was some talk in the House about maybe a 1st of April, April 2nd, when some guidelines were put in place, that being acceptable. But the House is really concerned that there's a statute in the Tennessee Constitution that talks about we shall not implement retroactive laws, and the state constitution is really the guardrails for which we draft laws up here. And there's really a fear if we start messing with that and we start drafting laws that the lawyers tell us are blatantly unconstitutional, that this will just have a ripple effect. I don't think anybody in the House that voted against that bill thought that bill would die on the floor at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. We really thought it was going to go back to conference. They were going to work out some of these issues, and then it would come back to the floor either the next day or earlier that morning. My vote on the board was not to kill the bill by any means. It was simply to send it back to conference and let them work on the retroactivity to be sure that bill was constitutional and that everybody was comfortable. We had virtually every lawyer in the House stand up and say that they had a problem with the retroactivity, how it was drafted, and that there was a real fear that it would not stand up in the court. So that's my vote was simply to let them continue the process of working on the bill. All the time, most of the time up here when we send a bill back to committee or keep working on it, it's just to get it in the proper form. There was not enough votes at that point to feel that the bill was in proper form to move on. That in no way means that those people that voted against it do not believe that we need this law enacted. I think everybody supports the business community and supports the fact that we need legislation. It's just getting it right and getting it palatable.
Just push back a little bit here, Brandon, if you will allow me a little bit. But and I'm not saying the Tennessean is infallible, but they reported that Lambert, who I think is the House, is it Majority Leader?
Yes, sir.
He was okay with retroactivity back to a certain date as long as it didn't precede the COVID cases in the nursing home there in Gallatin in his district. How does he rationalize being constitutional to go that far back, but not to the date that the Senate was looking at?
Well, and that lies part of the problem is there has not been enough work done on the legislation with the memberships to get us comfortable with even a partial retroactivity. We heard that on the floor very late, but there's still work to be done. I don't know how you justify doing part of something that you say is unconstitutional. So that's part of the process that we've still got work to do.
Jack, let me bounce back to you just a moment, but why did you decide to adjourn at that point instead of coming back like this past week and working out the differences?
Well, that was a call by our speaker, by the lieutenant governor, and I think he was frustrated that the House, didn't. I don't want to speak for our lieutenant governor, but I have to be very careful about this. But my sense is that he felt like the Senate had capitulated and agreed to some terms in the telemedicine bill that we didn't like, that we were uncomfortable with relative to parity and rate setting in the code, which is always a very dangerous thing to do. But we agreed to do that for a limited amount of time, which is something that the House felt strongly about. And in exchange for that, they would agree to our terms on the liability protection bill. And this is the way the process works. We're a bicameral legislature, and we can't pass a bill if the Senate can't pass a bill if the House doesn't pass it, and vice versa. So a lot of these kind of negotiations take place always during session. So there was some frustration. I think nerves were a little frayed right there at the end, and again, we didn't just decide to start working on these. And by the way, Dave, you said Friday night, Saturday morning. It was Thursday night, Friday morning. It was 3 a.m. Friday morning. But and we weren't going to come back on Friday because it was Juneteenth. And if you spill over into Monday, you can't just come back on Monday. You'll be there till Thursday. It's just the way the process works. So I think our speaker's sentiment was it's time to go home. And by the way, and it's been reported, and it is accurate, the lieutenant governor and I did go down while the House was debating the liability protection bill. We walked down to the governor's office and met with the governor and discussed the prospect of a possible special session. And he was amenable to that. He didn't commit, but he said that was something he would consider if we wanted to maybe try to come back.
Hey, Dave, if I could add to that discussion.
I wanted to go ahead. Yeah, I was going to come to you next. As a former speaker, you've been in the middle of some of these kind of negotiations. What did you see happen, and what are your recommendations?
It was a straight up vote on the House floor, Dave. It was 46 House members voted to pass the Senate compromise, and we had 36 vote against it. So the problem was constitutionally got to have 50 votes to pass the bill, and we had 9 members, I think, absent because it was such a late night. So the House is in agreement with the legislation. We just lacked 4 votes getting it to 50.
I see. Sam, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yes. 2 things. Glenn read a really good statement that evening about the constitutionality of that before the vote, and compliment you on that, Glenn. And but when I started seeing all the lawyers opposing it, that's the first sign that I knew something was up, and supported it. And there was a severability clause in that too, if I recall correctly. And Jack explained it well. And like you said, nothing really good happens after midnight, and people were tired and ready to go. But Glenn's right. I think if the other members had been there, it would have passed out of the House.
Glenn, the prospects of a special session, look like they're getting more and more likely. What do you see there, and would you support a special session? And if so, would you support these two bills that you failed to reach consensus on?
Yes, I supported them initially, both the telehealth and the Safe Harbor Act. They're needed. We've got to have both of those. They just help the progress of Tennessee, protect our businesses, promote the keeping of healthcare costs lower. And so special session would be relatively brief. I think we'd come in, we'd go right back to our committees. They would report out within a day, and the next day I feel like we would pass it straight up. So I hope the governor and I hope the House and Senate leadership push for a special session. We need to pass both of these bills.
Brandon, same question for you. Would you support the special session, first of all, and second of all, would you support in particular, the chamber's interested in the coronavirus liability protection aspects of it?
Yes, I fully support a special session, but I also think if we're going to come back and spend multiple days, we might look at other legislation that's important for Tennesseans, not just pick and choose a couple pieces. When those committees convene, they can do a lot of work in an hour. So I would hate to call our members back from all across the state and incur that financial burden without actually getting a fair amount of work done. I do support the legislation. I just think that we need to work out the retroactivity, and we need some more help in assuring the members that it is in fact constitutional. And really, the problems it's going to have is going through the subcommittee. That subcommittee that it has to pass back through had a lot of no votes on that board. So if there's not some negotiation, there's not some work, and those members don't feel confident that this is in good form, it will not be a vote. It'll never make it to the floor.
Which subcommittee is that?
It's civil, isn't it, Brandon?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's got to go through civil first. And that committee, there was a lot of no's on that board. So, they really got to make those members comfortable and get that in good form. But the intent of the bill is totally supported. Especially, my business, we fabricated materials to be put in hospitals all over the Southeast. And, I need that bill to pass. I particularly need that bill to pass. But it has to be done in a way that's palatable and it's constitutional. And until we remove that fear, it's going to have a little problems. But in the end, we will reach a compromise. It will pass, and we'll get the protection that Tennessee companies need.
Back to you just a second, Glenn, but what about the constitutionality of it? Sam mentioned you made a...
I read from the sitting Chief Justice Bill Coke that said, in his opinion, and he serves on the Tennessee Supreme Court, that if it has to do with the welfare of the state, that you can pass something like what was before us on that 3 o'clock Friday morning session. So yes, I personally have no question based on a Supreme Court justice's opinion that we could pass that and it would pass muster.
Jack, if you would, let's delve specifically into the coronavirus liability bill for a minute. Could you explain to us exactly what that bill would do and why the business community, the school systems, and everyone are so interested in having that bill passed?
Sure. In a nutshell, what it would do, Dave, is just say that if an entity, and it could be, again, a business, it could be a local government, a church, hospital, if they are substantially compliant, and I believe that's the legal term, and I may have that wrong, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that's the term or the concept that is used to say that if that business is substantially compliant with the guidelines that are used and recommended at that time. And think about this, we have phase 1, we have phase 2, we have phase 3. And not only do we have multiple phases, we have multiple phases in various times in different parts of the state. So the way the legislation was crafted was to say that whatever the guidelines are, so if you own a business in the city of Franklin or Brentwood or Nolensville, or a church, or you're running a school, this applies to the Williamson County school system, whatever it is, if you are compliant, substantially compliant with those guidelines to try to keep your employees and your customers or whoever patronizes your business or attends your church or whatever safe, then you're protected. You have liability protection. The concern is that obviously with COVID-19 and there's so many unknown variables about here. What we don't want, the worst thing in the world we could have for our economy right now is to have businesses and any other type of entities having to deal with nuisance lawsuits, being sued. Somebody comes down and is unfortunately diagnosed with COVID, and then they trace it back and they think that they caught it when they ate at this restaurant or they attended this church or they, their kid caught it while they were at school. Well, how do you prove that? I don't know. It'd probably be very difficult to prove, but we'd just rather not have those types of nuisance lawsuits out there that are costing people a lot of money on legal fees.
Right. Sam, any color you want to add to that?
No, I've received numerous emails and letters and calls from the business community, our nonprofits, HOAs, and this is critical to them going forward. And I just felt like it was we needed to do this. And if we do need a special session to correct it, I think we can come back and do it. And it's my understanding we can only address one item, what they bring us back for across the General Assembly. And maybe Jack and Glenn can correct me on that.
Well, it could be more than one item, but it does have to be specifically articulated in the governor's call for the special session. So it could be more than one item. The governor could say, I call the General Assembly back to deal with this and this.
Right.
And but you can't take up anything outside of that call.
That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Glenn, this is important to your district as well. Anything in particular about that bill that resonates with your district?
Just the protection. I don't want to beat a dead horse. Jack and Sam and Brandon have articulated it well. Brandon, being a businessman, articulated it well, but we've, in this time, the courts have gotten very aggressive going after our business community. We need to protect the business community and our churches and our nonprofits. And that's why we need this.
The telemedicine bill, honestly, it hadn't been a whole lot in the media about that. Tell us, I'll start with you again, Jack. Tell us what that involves and the importance of it.
Yeah, and it is confusing because it is taking place right now, and via an executive order from the governor. The governor has obviously issued a number of executive orders during this COVID outbreak, and one of those, or several of those, have dealt with telemedicine. So there are regulatory issues with telemedicine, and I think most everyone, again, I touched on this earlier, agrees that a doctor should be able to consult with a patient via this technology we're using right now. There are many things that a doctor and patient can do together via using technology like this. Some things can't. Sometimes the doctor needs to touch you and lay hands on you to appropriately diagnose you. But doctors know when they can and when they can't do it. So, excuse me, not to get too far into the weeds, but under existing law, you could do it if you were at another doctor's office. So let's say, for example, you live in Perry County, and you're at your primary care physician's office, and you need to consult with a specialist in Nashville. You could do that from one doctor's office to another doctor's office. but you couldn't do it from your home directly to your primary care physician. That's one example of a regulatory barrier that we want to remove. We want to allow physicians to be able to do this. Where we get a little, where we end up with some disagreement is with regards to reimbursement rates. I believe that a physician should be reimbursed at the same rate as if they are in your office. And Blue Cross Blue Shield, by the way, who is the largest carrier, I think they cover about 60% of Tennesseans, they are reimbursing at parity. The House version of the bill was going to require and mandate parity in terms of reimbursement rates among all insurance companies. The Senate had some heartburn about that. Not that we don't want physicians to be reimbursed at that rate, we do. The question is, though, should we be stipulating that in the code? Because that is typically a contractual arrangement between a provider and the payer. And I just think it's a very slippery slope if we start dictating reimbursement rates in the code. And I've told my friends who are in the medical community this, who have argued with me that we should have it in the code. You don't want 132 knotheads who serve in the General Assembly deciding what you get paid for your services. Trust me, let's don't start going down that path. That's not going to end well for you. It should be a market-driven contractual arrangement as it is now. That was the difference. The Senate agreed to put parity in. It was a compromise for 18 months, meaning that as telemedicine evolves and does become more prevalent in healthcare delivery, that we would go ahead and require parity. And when I say parity, means the doctor gets reimbursed by the insurance company at the same rate as an office visit. And we were going to require that for 18 months, and then it would come out. That was the compromise. The Senate wanted no parity in there at all. The House wanted permanent parity. We agreed to 18 months, and again, that bill did not pass either. And it could be something that we take up in special session in addition to the liability bill.
Any of our House members have any contrasting opinions on that?
I'll just chime in.
Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I'll just chime in, and I really appreciate what the conference committee came up with, which was the 18 months. Because I do believe that until you prime the pump, until you get the insurance companies engaged, they're just going to resist any change. But Jack makes a very good point. It was my concern as well, is that having something like that in code has long-term consequences. So I really appreciate, Jack, what y'all came up with in the conference committee.
Sam?
Yeah, I was just going to tell the listeners that they have not used telemedicine. It really works well. In fact, I did my annual checkup with my doctor, and then followed up with just going by the clinic and getting some blood work. So it is a emerging technology that will really help our rural health providers out there and our citizens.
Brandon, any comment there?
No, I think everybody did a good job. I think it's an evolving market. It's definitely something that's going to happen. The only little bit of pushback I've heard from anybody is in this, are we going to lose a level of service? There is an importance of that interaction with that doctor and that face-to-face. As much as I like doing this on the Zoom meeting, I think you do lose a little bit of a personal touch. And, I would hate for us to all not ever be able to sit face-to-face with our doctors, but it's definitely a tool that needs to be used, and going forward, it'll be great to have. That's not to say that personal interaction with the doctor is not important, and I would like to see that continue. But this bill in no way takes that away. So we'll get this worked out like the other ones, and we'll do what's best for Tennesseans.
I heard through the grapevine that the CON, or the remind me what that stands for.
Certificate of Need.
Certificate of Need. Thank you, Sam. There was some legislation that was weaving its way amongst and around all these other issues. Sam, since you were so quick to remind me what that stood for, if you would tell us what's going on there.
Well, I want to thank my senator. He was the one that actually said that certificate of need. That is, hospitals, and I'm going to try to explain this. I was not involved in the legislation. Jack could probably, Glenn, probably could do a much better job, but it could have an impact on our local county hospital if it was passed. And I think our delegation, all four of us had concerns about that and expressed our concerns. And we just wanted to make sure any kind of change in how hospitals and specialty clinics were set up, because you have those for profit and those who have to provide the services, and it could have a serious consequence on our rural hospitals. So we had concerns about that, and I think we as a group expressed those concerns and voted accordingly.
Okay. Brandon, excuse me, hold that thought for just a minute, Brandon. Jack, on the budget, you all did pass a budget and slightly trimmed it back from what had been approved back in, I guess it was March, or was it, when were you last in session? March, I believe. The very little difference, but tell us a little bit about the differences in the budget that you ultimately passed. I guess it was last Thursday night.
Yeah. So you're right. We did pass a budget. Interesting bit of trivia. It was the last time we passed two budgets in one general session of the General Assembly was 2002. And I guess Glenn might have been there for that time, but that was kind of as we were coming out of the income tax battles. So we did pass a budget in March. We did revise that budget, and basically we had to cut $500 million out of the current fiscal year, which will close at the end of this month. Here in just about 4 days, our fiscal year will end, and we had a $500 million shortfall because of COVID for the current fiscal year, and then we project $1 billion shortfall in the coming year. And essentially, the way we're going to balance both of those fiscal years is by using one-time money to fund recurring expenses, which we don't like to do. But we have a fair amount of fairly sizable amount of one-time money with some carry forward that we had from the last fiscal year. We're going to be able to plug those holes. We also empowered the governor to take a look at all of our reserve accounts. We talk about a rainy day fund, which is important, and that's kind of our savings account. But every department and agency, virtually every one of them, also carries some amount of reserves that they keep basically, in their savings accounts. So we've empowered the governor. There's about $4 billion combined in all of those reserve accounts. And so we've empowered the governor to do an analysis, department by department, agency by agency, to identify about $600 million is what we're asking him to go pull out of those reserve accounts. You take that with the carry forward money we had from the last fiscal year, we'll be able to plug those holes. Unfortunately, we had to take out teacher raises. We had to take out state employee raises, which we didn't want to do, but really had no choice. And so we'll be structurally out of balance, meaning we're using non-recurring money to fund recurring expenses, and that's never a good place to be. But we do hope to, by the third year out, possibly second year out, be back to a structural balance. And if we assume even just a modest growth rate from this fiscal year to next fiscal year of 2%, and then 3% in the following year, we'll get back to that structural balance. So, and by the way, we'll do all of this without touching the actual rainy day fund, which will continue to have about $1.1 billion in it. So it's a bad situation. Thankfully, we were in the best fiscal shape we've ever been in coming into this. And so we're gonna be able to get through it, and we'll maintain our AAA credit ratings. And one other thing we did, Dave, is we did decide to bond some projects, a little over $200 million worth of long-term capital projects that, we've bragged on this show before about not borrowing any money and paying cash for everything. I think it was very prudent. It freed up about a little over $200 million in cash that we need right now to bond some projects. I think there were about 6 long-term capital projects that we'll bond. We'll put those on a 20-year amortization. Because of our outstanding credit rating, the interest rate on that, as you know, in the financial services business, that the money is virtually free right now. So it's a very, very low interest rate. And so it makes sense to do that. So a combination of all those things got us balanced, and we have a pathway to get back to structural balance in 2 to 3 years.
And
Sam,
Dave, also on the budget, one of the change from March to now is how the grants to cities and counties, we took the strings off on that. And actually, we increased the amount paid to Williamson County by nearly $600,000. They'll get 2.8 million from the state to use as the local government sees fit.
noticed, I think the city of Franklin's going to get a couple of million.
1.8, yeah.
Brentwood and Spring Hill about $1 million apiece, and Nolensville and Fairview maybe $250,000. How are those amounts determined? Just curious.
By population.
Okay, so it was on population. I'm sure our cities and county will appreciate that extra appropriation to kind of help make ends meet during this next year. Brandon, I do want to come back to you now. You had a rather ambitious agenda going into this year, and as the plans were being made for this last session of the Senate and House, the Senate made clear that they only wanted to address a very limited number of bills. I know you've got a different opinion about that. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts and why.
Well, the leadership in the House basically told us if you're going to be paid to be here and you want to continue your work, to continue working. So all the legislation I filed, I went ahead and worked through the committee process, and that's simply because you see things change up here so rapidly, and sometimes you think you're in good form, much like our liability protection bill, and sometimes you see things go off the rails and people raise concerns. So I saw it as an opportunity to run my bills through committee and be sure they were in good form, be sure my committee members and colleagues were accepting of the legislation, and some of the stuff we worked on, I do believe it's time urgent. So it was a process to take the work as far as possible, and in hopes that maybe it made a list in the Senate, and there was not a change of heart, but the Senate was working through their agenda, and just hoping maybe some of these would fall into the cracks and get pushed through. But that's not, and not to say that was my agenda. It's just the legislation that working in those criminal justice subcommittees that we saw was needed for Tennessee, and so we thought it was prudent to go ahead and get those bills drafted and take them as far as possible on the House side.
Given the limited session, were you able to get any of your legislation that you were most interested in through?
I think I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 passed on the House floor unanimously. Most of those were related to victims' rights, or one particularly was submission of evidence. We had a bill that basically cut the submission time for sexual assault crimes. When those kids are taken, they're submitted to TBI for processing. Well, our turnaround time right now is almost close to a year. So I think everybody's in agreement that that's way too long. It impedes the justice process. So we're trying to get that evidence to TBI submitted and back quickly. Members of law enforcement agreed to cut the submission time in half. That was a big lift on their part. So we thought that was very time critical to get that passed as soon as possible in the House and get that implemented. That went through. There's a bill we call the Defense Doctrine that basically outlines that if you're a victim of violent sexual assault, you have every right to use deadly force to protect yourself or protect a child or a third party. Unfortunately, in TCA, we did not do a good job in and defining what serious bodily harm was. So we went into TCA and cleaned that up and made it where people could actually defend themselves to the fullest measure possible. And then we had another bill related to threats against employees of schools. We changed, technology has changed so much that a lot of these threats are now done online through text messages. We went into TCA, cleaned up the language to include online threats and text messages, and that was, we felt it was time urgent as well. But very confident that when we come back into session, that these will be taken up again. I think the fact that they were unanimously passed on the House floor will be a good indication to the Senate that they are good in good form, and it'll help when we return, just to be sure that they move swiftly and we get these laws passed and implemented.
Glenn, how about your results for the year? Anything that you are particularly pleased that happened? Anything that you're concerned about being discussed if in a new session coming back?
No, it'll be a new General Assembly. There'll be all newly re-elected House members, and half the Senate will be newly re-elected. And I think we're geared towards meeting the slowdown in the economy. Hopefully, it's picked back up. And so I don't see anything on the horizon that's troubling. Just a lot of work. And I know it on the surface, it seemed like the House and the Senate were locking horns, but that's just a common occurrence. It just made the news this time. Usually it's just done behind closed doors and we work it out. So I do want to add one thing, and kudos to the governor and the House and Senate. There is $200 million in the budget for those businesses that didn't get the PPP, Paycheck Protection, whatever the other P is. There's now $200 million available to our small business people to help them get through this COVID. So I just want to kind of throw that out there, Dave, just to remind our business community. Call one of us if you think you may qualify.
Any particular qualifications they need to meet?
There is, and I don't know what it is off the top of my head. Jack, do you, Sam, Brandon, do you guys know?
I think it somewhat mirrors the Paycheck Protection Program at the federal level, but there are probably some distinctions there. Again, there were some businesses that maybe you would have thought would have qualified for that on the federal level, but didn't, and so we wanted to try to fill that in a little bit at the state level.
Good. Sam, what did you accomplish this year, and what do you see as
the 211th General Assembly overall, the first part was very successful, I think, before all this turmoil hit. The first part of the session passed 10 bills, everything from cockfighting to Katie Beckett. And but this time, with the challenges we faced, the number of bills we passed was definitely reduced. We did pass something for the city of Franklin, the private act, at the last moment, all of us working together on that. But one bill Jack and I worked on was the peer-to-peer car sharing. That really helped protect our citizens as they rent cars from private individuals coming in from out of state. It's a new technology, and it needed some guardrails on it to also really protect our airport.
What that is, Sam?
Well, peer-to-peer car sharing is an individual can rent their car to an individual visiting, say, Tennessee. And what it does, it provides consumer protection, insurance protection, and also it allows the state to participate and draw from the marketplace facilitator tax that we implemented, and I think goes in effect in this October. And particularly there was a car sharing app from a company out of California. And in Metro Airport, for instance, in 2014, they noticed a lot more cars coming in, and they found out Uber and Lyft was operating at the airport. And they went from 60,000 car rental or rides a year out of the airport to 1.8 million before this hit. So with this new technology coming in, people renting cars, we had to provide the airport protection for people doing business at the airport, because they have to follow federal guidelines to maintain their grants. And for instance, 6 years ago, there was 5 dedicated parking spots for Uber and Lyft. Now there's 120. And so what we did, we gave the 5 commercial airports that we created, the General Assembly back in 1969, authority to manage their ground transportation program with this new technology.
Great. Jack, what do you consider the accomplishments of the session?
Well, certainly the budget, that's the one constitutional requirement we have, is to pass a balanced budget. And we did that twice, given these crazy circumstances we're in. I know we tend to focus more kind of on the business side of things, but I do want to say that we passed, the House and the Senate did pass what is probably the most comprehensive and sweeping pro-life legislation that any state has ever taken up. And that was one of Governor Lee's agenda items, and we did pass that. And I was proud to be the sponsor of that, very proud of that legislation. And then again, talking about, kind of the priorities, and the Senate and House, as we often do, took different pathways. The Senate, I think, kind of looked at it from top down in terms of priorities and what needed to get done during our brief resumption of session. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the House and Senate about what bills would be taken up and considered. But I think we other than those two that we didn't get done at the last minute that we may need to address in the special session, I think we did a good job of taking care of those most important items that are important to the state. And we have a number of good things that are teed up for January, and we will be back there in 6 short months. And hopefully we'll be in a better place than we are right now.
Dave, I could add one more thing. Other than just legislation, working with for the delegation, our staff did a great job and continue to do a great job helping our constituents with unemployment claims. When they hit over 116,000 back in April, and this past week it was 21,000. And we have people from Williamson County needing help with that, and our administrative assistants and staff really worked hard to help those, and they follow up with our citizens needing help on those unemployment claims and the paycheck protection. So that takes up a lot of time too. It's just not just legislation, but constituent services is a big part of our job.
Give our thanks to your assistants. They make us all look better, I know, and I know Amanda makes you look a lot better, Sam. So
well, yeah, that's hard work. And so does my wife.
Pam's right there with her. So the Supreme Court kind of threw an unexpected curve to the election this fall and this summer yesterday by saying that the state does have to do a vote by mail for pretty much anybody that wants it, as I understand it. How are we going to handle that? Are our county election commissions ready for that? And how's that going to change things? Jack, you want to start off?
Yeah, so that was a trial court decision by Chancellor in Davidson County. It's a horrible decision, absolutely blatant case of judicial activism, dictating one judge in Davidson County, dictating how we will conduct our elections in Tennessee.
I think the Supreme Court upheld that decision yesterday.
No, I'm sorry, Dave, they did not. They did not uphold the decision. They agreed to expedite review of the decision, but they did not issue a stay. And I'm disappointed in the Supreme Court that they did not overturn or stay that decision, which means that that trial court decision will be in place for our August primary election. And for some local governments, it will be there might be a general. So I spoke with the Secretary of State, the coordinator of elections. This is going to be an unnecessary burden on our local governments. In Tennessee, under existing law, if you're over 60, you can request an absentee ballot for virtually any reason. If you're under 60 and you have a medical reason why you cannot go to the polls, you can request an absentee ballot. But to say that anyone, if you're 23 years old and perfectly healthy, that you can request an absentee ballot, it just sets us up for all kinds of potential fraud and abuse in elections. All we have to do is look at other states that do this, and the number of ballots that are not even counted, or they're mailed out and they're not returned. Just having millions of ballots go out to people's mailboxes, and then you have no way to enforce voter ID, which we have in Tennessee. So it's a horrible decision made at the trial court level. The Supreme Court has agreed to take it up, avoid the Intermediate Court of Appeals, and review that decision. But what I wish they had done would have to stay that decision, so we can, while they're reviewing it, for at least for the August elections, we could conduct our elections as we normally do. Chances are that the Supreme Court will be able to review that and make a decision on the lower court decision by the November election. So that's at least one bit of good news. But this is going to create all kinds of problems for our local election officials for the August primaries, which are just right around the corner.
Pardon my misrepresentation on that.
No problem.
You always keep me in line, and I appreciate that. Sam, Glenn, Brandon, any of you have any comments on that?
I do. I agree with the senator. I couldn't be more adverse to that decision than because here's what's going to happen in North Carolina. Activists went through and collected ballots from people that had no intention of voting and just basically said, "Give me your ballot," and they basically voted for them. We know in Camden, New Jersey, that 150 ballots just were never delivered, and they were found at the post office. Well, what's that going to entail when they get delivered and into the wrong hands? So it's just ripe for corruption, and I am disappointed that Judge Lau, who has a history of trying to be a legislator as a sitting judge, a very low first level court judge, has put the state in a tailspin.
Right. One more subject we'll try to cover today, and that's the racial tension, the issue of the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust, and the distraction it continues to cause. Sam, you're a military guy, history buff too, I think, and how do you weigh in on all these issues about the Confederacy and the symbols that it has now been labeled with? What do you think the proper thing to do here is?
Well, there's a right way to do it, and then there's the mob way to do it. And anytime a mob makes a decision, it's generally a bad decision. We see the destruction of monuments when they start tearing down, particularly like President Grant in San Francisco. You know, it's probably not about civil rights. It's probably about anarchy, and that's very disturbing to me. The rule of law is very important. Our state troopers and local police up in Nashville, their commitment to protecting the Capitol has been extraordinary. The destruction of the Carmack statue was, and he's a very controversial figure, of course, and there has been talk and legislation moving forward to replace, for years, to replace Carmack with Davy Crockett up there in front of the Capitol. But as far as the Forrest bus, that's going to be the Capitol Commission decision. I would, if it was my choice, I would like to see, and I've recommended, in fact, there's an op-ed out there that a lot of people don't know. There's two Tennesseans that have not been recognized over the years. And Andrews Air Force Base is named after Frank Andrews, a three-star general who grew up within the shadow of the Capitol. There's no bust of him. And a lot of people don't know, we have a military annex to the State Museum in the basement of the War Memorial Building. And I would like to see General Forrest bust placed next to his great-grandson, who was a brigadier general, first general killed in the European theater during World War II. And he was flying a B-17 over Nazi Germany. He stayed at the controls and his crew bailed out. And so those are some things we need to consider as we go forward. Just think about the image of reconciliation from Civil War and the unity that the nation created to win World War II, what his great-grandson, Nathan Bedford Forrest III, represents, and we can put them together in the appropriate military hall. And I hope we head toward that. I've talked to some other legislators about that idea over the years, and it just generate interest in that. But it's very important. We respect the rule of law. We do not allow anarchy in our cities. It's some places it's gone way too far, and we just need to put a stop to it.
Brandon, what's your suggestions here?
Well, I mean, I've just got a different view on all these busts. I mean, we've spent so much time talking about statues for men that lived 200 years ago. I just don't get it. I mean, I understand some of my colleagues are concerned about what we do with them. I don't share as much concern in the fact that we just built a really nice state museum. It wouldn't hurt my feelings if every bus up here went to the state museum. I don't see, in present form, how we have them presented. They're up on a pedestal with a little sign that's, 4 inches by 6 inches. You don't learn any history by reading a plaque to what somebody's name was. So, if we want to honor history and tell a story, I think it should be done in a setting that's appropriate, and that would be the State Museum. I don't see that the Capitol is any place to try to do that. We're trying to make laws and move our state forward. I don't have time to argue about the men that lived 200 years ago. I just don't see. I think it's a complete waste of time, and it is controversial. So I'm ready to address the situation and move on to the next thing that'll make our state better. So I'm ready for it to no longer be a talking point.
Glenn, what's your suggestion?
First, I would say I think Brandon and Sam both have articulated well, and I think we need to realize that these are symbols. They will not improve once they're taken down, once they're moved, and maybe they should be, but once they are, that's not the problem. The problem is children not getting education, poor performing schools, no fathers in the home. If we want to change a way of life, if we want to make things better for people, that's what we have to improve. Removing a statue or keeping a statue up has no effect. And so we're focused on the wrong thing as a society. Dave, you and I probably remember, it was about 50 years ago, we saw times just like this. We had a virus going through that was very deadly, actually more deadly than it is today. We had unrest in the streets. We were involved in a war in Vietnam, and we came through it, and we unified again, and we will do that this time as well.
Good point, Glenn. Jack, your last. Tell us your thoughts and if you know them, what the governor's thoughts are on these issues.
Well, the governor's made some public comments recently about continuing the conversation and having an open dialogue about all of these issues, and I think that's very important. And certainly, we all encourage that. Relative to the Capitol Commission and the bus, there is a process there, and the Capitol Commission will likely take this issue up and consider it again. But I want to really echo something that Sam said. We're going to do it through process. We're going to be thoughtful. We're going to be methodical about this. The Nathan Bedford Forrest bust was put in the Capitol by a supermajority Democrat-controlled General Assembly, a Democratic governor. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Democrat. And so, we will contemplate these things in a methodical way, and I suspect that the Capitol Commission will be convened, sometime this summer, maybe into the fall, and we'll continue to have those conversations. And that's the way the process should work, and that's why it was put into place. And by the way, it's not just the Capitol Commission. That vote, if there is a vote in the Capitol Commission to take any action, it then goes to the Tennessee Historical Commission, and they have to review it and contemplate it. So it's a thorough process, and it should be, whether it's putting something in the Capitol or removing something from the Capitol. And I will tell you, how polarized people are about this, and how many very strongly worded emails on both sides of the issue I get almost every day.
just so much appreciate you gentlemen for taking the time to kind of give us the backstory on so many of these issues and what you're seeing from a broad perspective out of your districts. And it's just a great opportunity for us to learn more about your jobs and how you're representing us. And we appreciate all you do for us. Want to thank Creed Henderson and the crew over at WCTV Channel 3 for making us look so good. Creed, Tom Lawrence, again, congratulations to you. Thanks for the WAKM AM 950 crew for keeping us on the air. Chamber staff, Matt, Kell, Nancy, Griffin, and Jenna, we appreciate the backup to make this happen every month. Our sponsors, AT&T and Vanderbilt, so helpful in underwriting some of the cost of this. And just thank our audience for being there every month, and look forward to being back next month. Probably we'll have you guys back if there is a special session, and look forward to having that conversation again. So
Thank you,
y'all have a
Dave.
good day, and thank you very much.